There was a hallway in that building that led to nowhere. No exit, no windows, no way out. The door only locked from the outside. And one night at 3 a.m., someone locked me inside it. For about a year, I worked the graveyard shift as a night attendant in a residential high-rise downtown. The building was old, originally constructed in the late 1960s, and the condo association had persistent security concerns that stemmed directly from its outdated design. Both levels of the underground parking garage were partially accessible from street level, which meant there were multiple entry points scattered around the perimeter, several of them sitting in the blind spots of a camera system that had been retrofitted decades after the building was built and never quite covered everything it needed to. Because of that, my job required me to make 2 full patrols of the entire building during every shift. Walk the garage, check the stairwells, inspect the entry points, make sure nobody who didn't belong there had slipped in. The most serious incidents we dealt with were the occasional vehicle break-in or attempted carjacking. But what I encountered far more regularly were homeless people who had found their way into the garage, tucked into corners, crowed behind concrete pillars, pressed against heating vents, trying to get a few hours of warmth and sleep. Asking them to leave was the part of the job I hated most. Some of them were regulars, some of them knew my name, but the association's rules were absolute, and I didn't have the authority to look the other way. After several months on the job, I knew every inch of that building, every shadow, every hiding spot. The structure had been renovated multiple times over its 50-plus years, and each renovation had left behind architectural remnants, sealed-off rooms, abandoned hallways, concrete protrusions that served no purpose, stairwells that climbed to bricked-over doorways. The building was a maze of forgotten spaces, and most of them were unsettling in the way that only purposeless, decaying infrastructure can be. But one spot was worse than all the others. On the lower level of the garage, tucked behind a row of assigned parking spaces, there was a heavy metal door set into a cinder block wall. Behind it was a narrow corridor, maybe 3 feet wide, that ran directly beneath the ramp leading up to the second parking level. It extended roughly 25 feet into the darkness and terminated at a dead end. The only thing back there was a large water main with a manual shutoff valve, which was presumably the entire reason the corridor had been built. But in the dark, with nothing but a cheap flashlight cutting through the blackness, that pipe and valve assembly at the far end took on shapes that your brain desperately tried to make sense of, and never quite could. What made the corridor genuinely dangerous, though, wasn't the darkness or the claustrophobia. It was the door. The door had no padlock, no keyhole, no handle mechanism on the inside. What it had was a heavy-duty sliding bolt latch mounted on the exterior face. A simple, brutal piece of hardware that allowed anyone on the outside to seal the door shut with a single motion. From the inside, there was no corresponding mechanism, no release, no override. One way in, one way out, and it locked from the wrong side. The first time I discovered that corridor, I stood in the doorway and stared down its length for a solid minute, flashlight trembling slightly in my hand, and the only thought in my head was, this is a trap. Not metaphorically. Architecturally, functionally, in every practical sense, this was a space designed to contain something, and whoever was inside it had zero ability to leave without someone else's cooperation. I reported to management immediately, took photographs, wrote it up formally, recommended they remove the bolt latch, install an interior release, or at minimum padlock the door permanently shut so no one could access the space. They acknowledged the report. They were already aware of the corridor. They had no plans to change anything, which meant that every single night, as part of my patrol, I had to walk to that door, slide the bolt open, pull it wide, and shine my light down the length of that corridor to confirm it was empty. I never once stepped inside. Not once. Not for any reason. I would stand in the doorway, sweep the beam from wall to wall, confirm visual on the dead end, and close the door. Some instincts that predated rational thought told me that crossing that threshold was something I should never do. The corridor felt like a mouth. Every time I opened that door, I had the irrational but overwhelming sensation that it was waiting for me to step inside so it could swallow. Months passed. Nothing happened. The corridor was always empty. My fear began to feel melodramatic, almost embarrassing. I started to wonder if I'd built the whole thing up in my head, turned a mundane maintenance access into something sinister through nothing more than imagination and too many overnight shifts in a quiet building. Then came a Wednesday night in November. It was around 3 a.m., midway through my shift. The building had been dead quiet all evening. No incidents, no suspicious activity on the monitors, no residents calling down with complaints. Wednesday nights were almost always like that. The weekend shifts were when problems happen. Wednesdays were for boredom and clock watching. I was making my second patrol through the lower garage, moving through the familiar route on autopilot, when a sound cracked through the silence and echoed off the concrete walls. A door slamming. It came from across the garage, the direction of the corridor. The sound was unmistakable. Heavy metal connecting with the metal frame. It reverberated through the underground space like a gunshot. I stopped walking. Listened. Nothing followed. No footsteps. No voices. Just the low electrical hum of the fluorescent lights and the distant ticking of a cooling engine somewhere in the lot. I made my way toward the corridor, moving carefully, scanning between the parked vehicles as I went. When I rounded the last row of cars, my stomach tightened. The door to the corridor was standing wide open. I had closed it during my first patrol 2 hours earlier. I was certain of that. It was part of my routine. Check, close, move on. Someone had opened it. I stopped and surveyed the garage. Visually, I was alone. The rows of parked cars sat in orderly silence under the buzzing lights. Nothing moved. No shadows shifted. I called out, loud, authoritative, the way we were trained to do, identifying myself as building security and demanding that anyone present make themselves known. Silence. I walked to the open door and aimed my flashlight down the corridor. The beam cut through the dark and landed on the dead end, the pipe, the valve. No one was inside. But sitting on the floor, roughly 10 feet from the doorway, was a glass bottle. Empty. Lying on its side, I exhaled, felt some of the tension release from my shoulders. The scenario assembled itself quickly in my mind. Someone, likely a homeless person who'd gotten into the garage, had been using the corridor as a drinking spot. They heard me coming, panicked, bolted out the door, and scrambled over the low wall at the back of the garage where it met street level. It wasn't hard to do. I'd seen people scale it before. The wall was only about 5 feet high in that section, and it bordered a neighboring commercial parking lot. By the time I'd walked over from across the garage, they'd have been long gone. The corridor being in a camera blind spot meant there'd be no footage to review. Annoying, but not unusual. I stared at the bottle. It was clearly trash, and the building's policy was unambiguous. Any debris found during patrol had to be removed and disposed of. I wasn't allowed to leave it. The bottle was 10 feet inside the corridor, 10 feet past the threshold I had never crossed. I stood in the doorway, flashlight in one hand, the other hand resting on the door frame, and felt the familiar resistance rise up from somewhere deep in primal. Every night for months, I had refused to step inside this space. The bottle was right there, 10 feet. 5 seconds in, 5 seconds out. I almost didn't do it. I almost radioed upstairs and made up some excuse for why the bottle would have to wait until the morning maintenance crew arrived. But there was no one upstairs. The front desk was unmanned during my patrol rounds, and the rationalization engine in my brain was already running. There is no one in the corridor. You can see the entire length of it. You checked. The space is empty. You're a grown adult being afraid of a hallway. Pick up the bottle and move on. I took a breath, stepped inside. 3 steps. 5 steps. 8 steps. The walls pressed in on either side. The concrete ceiling sloped lower as the ramp above descended, and the air tasted different in here. Stale, damp, trapped. I reached down for the bottle. The door slammed shut behind me. The sound was catastrophic in that enclosed space, a detonation of metal on metal that seemed to compress the air itself. I dropped the bottle. It shattered on the concrete floor. I was already running before the echo died, covering the 10 feet back to the door in less than 2 seconds, and I hit it with both palms. It didn't move. I pushed, slammed my shoulder into it, pounded with my fists. The bolt on the other side was engaged. The door was locked. I was inside. I screamed. I hammered on the metal until my hands ached. I pressed my ear against the door and listened for footsteps, breathing, movement, anything that would tell me someone was on the other side. I heard nothing. Whoever had thrown the bolt was already gone. The corridor was approximately 3 feet wide and 25 feet long. The ceiling dropped to maybe 6 feet at its lowest point near the dead end. The walls were unpainted cinder block. The floor was bare concrete. There was no ventilation that I could feel. The only light was my flashlight. This was the scenario I had imagined every single night for months. The scenario I had warned management about. The scenario that had kept me from ever stepping past that threshold. And now I was living inside it. I reached for my phone. No signal. I knew it before I even looked at the screen, but seeing the empty bars confirmed it with a finality that made my chest constrict. I was underground, encased in cinder block and steel, with 6 stories of concrete and rebar stacked above me. Cell signals didn't penetrate down here on a good day. In this sealed corridor, I might as well have been in a coffin. I tried 911. Call failed. Tried again. Failed. Tried my supervisor's number. Failed. Tried every number I could think of. Nothing connected. The phone was useless. I was trapped. The reality of the situation settled over me like a physical weight. It was 3 a.m. on a Wednesday night. The earliest any resident would come down to the garage would be 6, maybe 6:30 for an early commute. That was 3.5 hours away. And even then, they'd have to walk past this particular corner of the garage, which most residents never did because their assigned spaces were on the upper level. It could be much longer than 3 hours. And while I sat in this corridor, unable to move, unable to communicate, unable to do anything at all, whoever had locked me in was free to roam the building unchallenged. As if to confirm that thought, a car alarm erupted somewhere in the garage. The shrill, rhythmic blaring penetrated the metal door easily, muffled but unmistakable. It wailed for about 2 minutes, then went silent. Not the way car alarms time out on their own, with a gradual wind down. It stopped abruptly, deliberately. Then another alarm. Different tone, different car, same pattern. A few minutes of shrieking, then a sudden, unnatural silence, then another. I counted 7 alarms over the next 40 minutes. Each one a confirmation that someone was systematically working through the garage, breaking into vehicles, and they knew exactly how to kill the alarm systems once they'd gotten what they wanted. They were organized, they were experienced, and they had neutralized the only obstacle in their way, me, with a glass bottle and a 10-foot walk. I had been baited. The bottle wasn't left behind by a panicked homeless person fleeing my patrol. It was placed there deliberately, just far enough inside the corridor to require me to cross the threshold. The open door, the slamming sound that drew me over, all of it was choreographed. Someone had watched me, studied my patrol patterns, learned of my routine. They knew I checked that door every night. They knew I never stepped inside, and they knew exactly what it would take to get me to break that rule. One bottle. One moment of rationalization. That's all it took. I stopped banging on the door, not because I'd given up, but because I realized the futility was costing me energy and composure. I sat down against the wall, turned off my flashlight to conserve the battery, and let the darkness close in. Complete darkness. The kind that doesn't exist in normal life. No ambient light, no glow from electronics, no streetlight seeping through a curtain. Pure, absolute black. For the kind where your eyes never adjust because there's literally nothing to adjust to. Every few minutes, I turned the flashlight on just long enough to confirm I was still alone, then off again. In those brief moments of illumination, the corridor looked different each time. Smaller, longer, more distorted, as though the walls were quietly rearranging themselves while the light was off. I sat there for what my phone told me was 2 hours and 14 minutes. At 5:17 a.m., I heard footsteps in the garage. Faint, echoing. The click of dress shoes on concrete, someone walking to their car. I threw myself at the door, pounded on it, screamed until my throat felt like it was tearing. The footsteps stopped. Then, after an agonizing pause, they grew louder, closer. A man's voice, confused and alarmed, on the other side of the door. "Hello? Is someone in there?" "Yes." "Please." The bolt. "Slide it to the left." "Please open the door." The grinding sound of metal on metal. The bolt sliding free. The door swinging open. fluorescent light flooding in like water breaking through a dam. A man in a business suit stood there, briefcase in hand, staring at me with an expression that cycled through confusion, concern, and alarm. I thanked him, babbling, probably incoherently, and pushed past him into the garage. The devastation was immediate and obvious. Broken glass carpeted the concrete floor. Window after window, vehicle after vehicle, shattered, gutted, interiors ransacked. Glove compartments hanging open, center consoles torn apart, personal belongings scattered across parking spaces. I counted 14 cars with smashed windows before I stopped counting. I called the police from the front desk phone. They arrived within 20 minutes. The report took hours. The camera footage showed nothing useful. The perpetrators had operated almost exclusively in the blind spots, and the few frames that captured movement showed dark figures in hoodies whose faces were never visible. They knew where every camera was. They knew the angles. They knew the gaps. Management fired me 4 days later. The official reason was failure to complete my patrol and secure the premises. The actual reason, I suspect, was that they needed someone to blame, and I was the most convenient option. The family whose BMW had its windows smashed and laptop stolen wasn't interested in hearing about a corridor with a bolt latch that management had refused to fix. The perpetrators were never identified. The case, as far as I know, remains open and unsolved. I don't work in security anymore. I don't work nights anymore. I moved out of that city 8 months ago, and I haven't been back. But there's something that still gnaws at me. Something the police noticed during their investigation that I haven't been able to stop thinking about. When they examined the corridor, they found marks on the inside of the door. Not mine. I pounded on it with my palms, and those marks were obvious, fresh, at shoulder height. These were different, lower, older, dozens of them. Scratch marks, deep, frantic grooves in the metal, concentrated around where a handle would be if one existed. Some of them had worn through the paint down to bare steel. The detective looked at them for a long time. Then he looked at me. "These aren't from tonight," he said quietly. I asked him what he meant. He ran his finger along one of the deeper grooves. Some of them were rusted, oxidized, months old, maybe years. "Someone else was locked in here before you," he said. "Maybe more than once." He paused. "The question is, did they all get out?" During the summer break between my sophomore and junior year, I decided to skip classes and pick up a job instead. I was burnt out on academics, tired of being broke, and figured a few months of steady paychecks would do me more good than another semester of lectures I could barely pay attention to. The gas station right across from campus was the first place I applied. They hired me on the spot, didn't even finish the interview, just handed me a shirt and told me when to show up. Looking back, that should have been the first red flag. Places that hire you that fast usually have a reason they can't keep people. The reason, in my case, was the shift. They only wanted me for overnights, 11 at night until 7 in the morning. 8 hours in a fluorescent box on the edge of a college town while the rest of the world slept. I knew it would destroy whatever remained of my sleep schedule, which was already hanging by a thread. But I needed the money, and I told myself I'd adjust. People work nights all the time. How bad could it be? For the first several weeks, it honestly wasn't bad at all. The opening hours of the shift, 11 to maybe 1, were actually hectic. College kids grabbing snacks, truckers fueling up, the occasional late-night rush of people leaving bars or finishing second shifts. Then around 1:30, the world went quiet. The parking lot emptied. The road outside went dark. And from then until about 5 a.m., when the early commuters and construction crews started trickling in for coffee, I had the place entirely to myself. I'd stock shelves, mop the floors, wipe down the counters, reorganize the cigarette display for the third time. And when all of that was done, I'd lean against the counter and scroll through my phone and try not to think about how unnatural it felt to be the only conscious person in a half-mile radius. Occasionally, someone sketchy would wander in. A guy who seemed a little too jittery. A woman who lingered too long near the register without buying anything. Once, a man in a bathrobe walked in barefoot at 4 a.m., bought a single banana, and walked back out without saying a word. Weird, but harmless. Nothing ever escalated beyond uncomfortable. Until the Thursday. Thursdays were dead. reliably, almost aggressively uneventful. My coworker, a quiet older guy named Gerald who worked the evening overlap, clocked out at midnight, and after that I was alone until the morning crew arrived. That particular Thursday was no exception. Gerald left, the lot cleared out, and by 1:30 I was deep into the nightly routine of restocking the drink coolers and trying to stay awake. At 1:58 a.m. a man walked in. I clocked the time because of what happened next, and because those 2 minutes would end up mattering more than I could have possibly understood in the moment. He was mid-30s, maybe older, shaved head, thick neck, arms covered in tattoos. Not the artistic kind, not sleeves of color and design, but crude black ink. Symbols I half recognized from documentaries and news reports. Lightning bolts, iron crosses, numbers that meant things I didn't want to think about. He was wearing a stained white t-shirt and jeans with mud on the knees, and he moved through the door with the heavy, deliberate energy of someone who was used to rooms adjusting to his presence rather than the other way around. He'd parked a lifted pickup truck, primer gray, mud-caked, one headlight dimmer than the other, directly in the handicap spot by the entrance. I noticed. I said nothing. He noticed me, though, looked me up and down from across the store. Something about my face apparently set him off, because before he'd even reached the back cooler, he'd already called me 2 slurs, one for ethnicity I'm not even part of. He decided I looked Jewish, and that was apparently enough. I kept my mouth shut, kept my eyes on the register, kept breathing. He wandered the aisles for a few minutes, not shopping, not browsing, prowling, running his fingers along the shelves like he was taking inventory of things he might want to break. Finally, he grabbed a 24-pack of cheap domestic beer and carried it to the counter. By then, it was 2001 a moose. My county has an alcohol ordinance. No sales between 2 a.m. and 6 a.m. The register literally locks out alcohol transactions during that window. I'd been trained on it during my first shift, warned about it twice by the manager, and told in no uncertain terms that violating it could result in termination and a fine for the store. I told him, as politely and apologetically as I could manage with my voice trying to crawl back down my throat. I explained that I couldn't sell him the beer. County law. Nothing I could do about it. I was sorry for the inconvenience. He didn't take it well. What followed was a 3-minute monologue about freedom, constitutional rights, government overreach, and my personal cowardice. His face went red. His voice got louder. He called me things I won't repeat. When I tried to explain that I was just doing my job and that the register physically wouldn't process the sale, he pivoted, told me I was a spineless puppet, that I probably loved being told what to do, that men like me were what was wrong with the country. I asked him to leave. The switch flipped again. Instantly, like a channel changing. The anger vanished and was replaced by something worse, warmth, friendliness. A big, easy grin spreading across his face as he leaned on the counter and told me it was no big deal, that we'd gotten off on the wrong foot, that he understood I was just trying to do my job. He was already in the store before too, right? The beer was already on the counter before the cutoff. What's 2 minutes between friends? Just ring it up. Nobody would ever know. He had a point. A small, technical, arguably reasonable point. And he was standing 3 feet from me, smiling at me with a warmth that didn't reach his eyes. And every instinct I had was screaming at me to make this interaction end as quickly and as peacefully as possible. I overrode the register, sold him the beer, then he asked for a pack of cigarettes. No restrictions on tobacco, so I gave him those too. He paid, left a few extra dollars on the counter with a wink, "Keep the change, brother," and walked out. I exhaled for what felt like the first time in 10 minutes. Then I watched him through the window. He didn't leave. He dropped the tailgate of his truck, sat down on the edge of the bed, cracked open a can, and started drinking. Right there, in the handicap spot. 3 feet from the store entrance, under the fluorescent glow of the gas station canopy, in plain view of anyone who might drive by. Not that anyone was going to drive by at 2:15 a.m. on the Thursday. I stood behind the register and watched, and felt the dread begin to build in my stomach like something physical, something with weight and texture. A few minutes later, a second truck pulled into the lot. Same general description, big, dirty, loud. 2 men got out, shaved heads, same style of tattoos. They walked to the first man's tailgate, and the 3 of them stood there talking, smoking, drinking, laughing in that barking aggressive way that sounds less like joy and more like a challenge. I knew I was supposed to go out there. Store policy was clear. No loitering, no open containers on the premises, no exceptions. I was supposed to walk out that door, approach a group of increasingly drunk extremists at 2 in the morning, alone, and politely ask them to leave. They knew it too. They kept glancing through the store window at me. Not nervously, not furtively. They looked at me the way cats look at something small and trapped. Amused, patient, curious to see what it would do. Before I could work up the nerve to do anything, a third vehicle arrived, an SUV, dark-colored, pulling in next to the trucks. 2 more men, same appearance, same energy. They joined the group at the tailgate like they were expected, greeted with handshakes and tossed beers. 5 of them now, all part of the same crew. My best guess was that they'd been in a bar that had closed at 2 and needed somewhere to continue the night. My worst guess involved the fact that the store owner's wife was Latina, and her name and photo were displayed on a community board right next to the front register. I tried not to think about the worst guess. Then the first man came back inside. He was noticeably drunker, louder, more expansive in his movements. He walked the aisles again, same prowling energy, same proprietary attitude, and returned to the counter with a second 24-pack. I opened my mouth to tell him that there was absolutely no way I could process another alcohol sale. It was now well past 2:30. The override I'd done for the first case was already a fireable offense. The second one would be, he cut me off before I got a single word out. He leaned on the counter close enough that I could smell the beer on his breath and the cigarette smoke baked into his shirt, and he said, calmly, quietly, with that same smile that stopped well short of his eyes, that he really wouldn't want to disappoint his friends out there. They were all having such a good time. It would be a real shame if the fun had to stop because of some kid behind a register who didn't know how to be reasonable. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make an explicit threat. He didn't have to. The math was simple. There were 5 of them and 1 of me, and we both knew exactly what that equation meant. I rang up the beer. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hit the keys. When the total came up, he dropped a crumpled 20 on the counter and told me to keep the change. Same wink. Same brother. He took the beer and walked out. The group cheered when he appeared with the fresh case. Through the window, I watched them tear into it with the coordinated efficiency of men who did this regularly. They'd already finished the first 24 cans, and I could see the empties scattered across the parking lot, crushed, kicked, tossed into the landscaping, rolling under parked cars. The lot looked like a landfill. I was trapped, not physically. The back door was right there. I could have walked out and disappeared into the night. But functionally, professionally, practically trapped. If I went out and confronted them, I was a 160-pound college student telling 5 drunk, emboldened white supremacists to go home. If I stayed behind the counter, they'd keep coming in for more beer, more cigarettes, more opportunities to remind me who was in control. And every minute they stayed, the mess got worse. The situation got more volatile, and my chances of getting through the night without something terrible happening got smaller. No customers were coming in. Of course they were. What sane person would pull into a gas station at 2:45 a.m. and see 5 skinheads drinking on the tailgate of a pickup truck and think, yeah, I'll stop here for a Gatorade? They were a human barricade. Their presence alone had turned the store into a no-go zone. I watched through the window as a car slowed down on the road, its driver clearly clocking the scene, and then accelerated away without turning in. More minutes passed. A 6th man arrived, then a 7th. They were multiplying, calling friends, texting, drawing in more of their crew like some kind of gravitational pull. The parking lot was turning into a rally. I couldn't take it anymore. I walked to the front door, quietly turned the deadbolt, and flipped the sign to closed. Then I went to the back office, closed the door, and called the police. I gave the dispatcher the address, the situation, the number of individuals, and what I suspected about their affiliations based on the tattoos. She told me a unit was on the way. I sat in the office and waited, watching the parking lot through the small security monitor on the desk, my knee bouncing uncontrollably. Several minutes later, it felt like an hour, a single patrol car pulled into the lot. One officer, he got out, approached the group, and said something I couldn't hear through the walls. What I could hear was the response, raised voices, aggressive posturing, the kind of shouting that sits right on the edge of violence without quite tipping over. For 2 or 3 minutes, I genuinely thought it was going to escalate into something the single officer couldn't control. I sat in that back office with my hand hovering over the phone, ready to call 911 again and beg for backup. But they left. Not all at once, in stages, grudgingly, with plenty of theatrics. Engines revving. Tires squealing. One of them threw a beer can at the store window hard enough that I heard the impact from the office. But they left. The officer waited until every vehicle was out of sight, then came inside. I unlocked the door with hands that still wouldn't stop trembling and asked him, practically begged him, to stay for a few minutes while I cleaned up the mess in the lot. Dozens of crushed cans. Cigarette butts. Broken glass from a bottle someone had smashed against the concrete. He agreed, leaned against his cruiser, and watched me work. When I finished, I thanked him. He nodded, told me to call again if they came back, and drove off. I stood alone in the empty lot under the buzzing canopy lights and looked at the road in both directions. Nothing moved. The night was quiet again, but the quiet felt different now, not peaceful, but held, restrained, like something waiting to exhale. I finished the shift, watched the sun come up through the store windows, handed the register off to the morning clerk at 7 without saying much. The next afternoon, I called the manager and quit. He didn't ask why. I think he already knew. I think that's why they'd hired me so fast, because the last person had quit for the same reason, and the person before them, and the person before them. That was 5 months ago. I found another job, daytime, indoors, surrounded by coworkers, normal hours, normal people. I should have moved on by now, but I haven't, because here's what I can't stop thinking about. This is a small town, a college town, sure, but small. The kind of place where you see the same faces at the same gas stations, the same grocery stores, the same intersections. And since that night, I've seen 2 of them. Once at the hardware store on 5th Street. Once in the parking lot of the restaurant where I eat lunch on Wednesdays. The first time, I told myself it was coincidence. Small town. Overlapping routines. It happens. The second time, the one from the restaurant lot, was the man from the counter. The first one. The shaved head. The symbols on his arms. He was sitting in the same primer gray truck with the mismatched headlights, parked 3 spaces from my car. He wasn't shopping. He wasn't eating. He was just sitting there. And when I walked past, he looked at me through his open window and smiled. That same smile. The one that never quite reaches the eyes. I got in my car and drove home a different way than usual. Checked my mirrors the entire time. Locked my apartment door, then checked it twice. He didn't follow me. At least, I don't think he did. But last night, I found something tucked under my windshield wiper in my apartment complex parking lot. A torn piece of cardboard with 2 words written on it in black marker. Keep the change. I haven't slept since.